You think you're bad at communication because you say the wrong things. But the real problem is you don't understand why you speak at all. Most people believe communication is about expression, getting your thoughts out, making your case, being understood. But if that were true, why do the people who talk the most tend to have the least influence? Why do you walk away from certain conversations feeling like you handed something over without knowing what it was? That gap between what you think communication is and what it actually does is where you've been losing for years. Here's the trap you've been living inside without realizing it. You've been optimizing for being heard, when the real game has always been about what you make other people feel about themselves. Every time you rush to fill silence, every time you over-explain your reasoning to people who never asked for it, every time you qualify your statements before anyone even pushes back, you are not communicating. You are leaking. You're broadcasting your internal anxiety through 100 micro behaviors, and everyone in the room with any level of perceptive intelligence is picking it up. You've been confusing output with influence, volume with weight, presence with meaning. And the uncomfortable part is that the harder you've worked at communicating better, the more you've probably calcified this exact pattern. This is what psychologists studying social dynamics call the approval loop. It's a self-reinforcing system where your need for validation from the person you're speaking to distorts every signal you send. Your sentences get longer when you're uncertain. Your voice rises at the end of statements that should be declarations. You use phrases like "I think" and "maybe" and "I don't know." Just an idea as preemptive shields, sacrificing the sharpness of your point before anyone gets the chance to challenge it. The approval loop operates below conscious awareness. You don't notice you're doing it because it feels like politeness, like humility, like social grace. But it isn't. A constant, low-grade transmission of one message: please don't reject me. And communication built on that foundation cannot carry real weight, no matter how carefully you choose your words. Think about a workplace scenario. You're in a meeting. You have an idea, a genuinely good one. You've thought it through, but you watch yourself introduce it with a 15-second disclaimer about how it might not be the right approach, and someone else probably already thought of this. The room receives it as low confidence. Not because the idea is weak, because you were afraid before you even opened your mouth. The idea didn't fail. You pre-failed it. That is the approval loop in real time. Now notice what your brain just did. You thought of someone else, a colleague, maybe, a friend who does this constantly. You applied this pattern to someone else immediately, and you felt slightly superior for a moment. That instinct to observe this in others before looking inward is itself part of the system. It's how the pattern stays protected. Watch yourself. The person who most needs to hear this is always the one most committed to believing it applies to everyone but them. Here's where it gets more interesting. Because underneath the approval loop is a second layer that almost no one talks about. Not because it's hidden, but because recognizing it is genuinely uncomfortable. It's called the selective muting strategy. And it's not about what you say. It's about what you've trained yourself never to say at all. Over time, every person in a social environment builds an internal map of what is safe to express, which observations land well, which truths create friction, which real opinions cost more than they're worth. And gradually, without any conscious decision, you begin editing yourself at the source. Not lying, exactly. Not even staying silent. Just routing around anything that might destabilize the dynamic. The selective muting strategy isn't weakness. It's adaptive. It helped you navigate environments where full honesty was genuinely risky: childhood homes, early professional settings, relationships where you needed something from someone and couldn't afford to lose them. The problem is that adaptive strategies calcify. What began as situational intelligence becomes your default operating mode. And now you're doing it everywhere, including places where it costs you everything: your credibility, your influence, your sense of your own thoughts. The real power dynamic no one names clearly is this: in any room, in any conversation, the person who is least afraid of what happens if things go wrong has the most control. Not the loudest person, not the most credentialed, the least afraid. Because fear contracts language. It compresses your sentences. It makes you hedge, qualify, deflect, and over-elaborate. And the people in the room, even if they couldn't articulate it, feel that contraction. They unconsciously calibrate trust downward. Not because they've judged you, but because your communication is doing the judging for them. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The one you probably already sense, but haven't let yourself fully look at. Every communication habit you've built that you think is smart or strategic, the qualifications, the hedging, the careful phrasing, the strategic silence, most of it is not strategy. It's fear wearing the costume of strategy. You've been telling yourself you're being measured, thoughtful, precise. But if you trace it back honestly, most of it goes to a single root. You are afraid of being misunderstood and having no way to correct it. Afraid of being seen as less intelligent than you believe yourself to be. Afraid that if you say the real thing, the relationship, professional or personal, will not survive it. That's not tactical intelligence. That's the primal terror of social rejection wearing a blazer. Now consider Ayanokoji Kiyotaka. If you've spent any time in certain corners of the internet, you know why he has the following. He's the cold, almost robotically rational protagonist of Classroom of the Elite, a student who says almost nothing, but controls almost everything. He speaks rarely. When he does, it lands. He has no visible need for approval. He doesn't explain his reasoning unless it serves a purpose. He can sit in complete silence across from someone who is emotionally demanding. And that silence exerts more pressure than most people's most articulate arguments. People are obsessed with him. They study him. They want to understand how someone operates with that level of emotional architecture. But here's the inversion most people miss. If Ayanokoji actually existed, if he sat next to you at work, if he was your friend, if you dated someone who communicated exactly like him, you wouldn't find it powerful. You'd find it disturbing. You'd feel unseen. You'd feel like you were never quite sure where you stood. The admiration for characters like him only works because you experience them from the outside. You see the outcomes of their behavior without living inside the relationship. You see the chess, not the loneliness. So why are so many people studying him? Why are you, maybe, one of them? It isn't really about becoming cold. It isn't about learning to strategize every syllable. The real reason we're drawn to characters like Ayanokoji is that we fantasize about being the one person they couldn't remain indifferent to. We don't want to be him. We want to be the exception to him. We want to be the one whose presence finally registers, the one whose words land differently, the one whose vulnerability offered once, carefully, would be met with something real. The hidden desire underneath the obsession. Not the power to affect no one. The hunger to matter to someone who seems impossible to reach. And what that tells you about yourself is actually the most useful data in this entire video. You're not drawn to Ayanokoji because you want his communication style. You're drawn to him because somewhere you believe that becoming more controlled, more strategic, more emotionally closed is what would finally make you matter. That the reason people overlook you now is that you're too available, too readable, too present. That the solution is to give less, but that's the approval loop talking again. dressed up as strategy. The real architecture of precise communication is not about saying less to seem powerful. It is about having such clarity about what you actually think, stripped of the need for the other person's reaction, that your words carry weight simply because they're true. That's the mechanism, not detachment. Clarity. Let's call this the calibration protocol, a 3-step reset for how you engage in any high-stakes communication. Step 1. Identify the exit before you speak. Not literally leaving the room. Before you begin any important conversation, ask yourself one question. What happens if this doesn't land the way I want it to? Trace the real consequence. Most of the time, it's less catastrophic than your nervous system is suggesting. A good idea doesn't disappear because it was received poorly once. A real relationship doesn't evaporate because you said something direct. When you've genuinely looked at the worst realistic outcome and it's survivable, your language changes automatically. The hedging drops. The qualifications thin out. Not because you've become cold, because you've become honest about the stakes. Step 2. Practice delivering the real sentence. Most of the time, you already know what you actually want to say. You know the true version, the one without the preamble, without the qualifiers, without the softening that strips it of force. The problem is, you never practice saying it. Not to yourself in front of a mirror, with affirmations. That's performance, not practice. Real practice is noticing the moment before you start hedging and holding that original sentence for 3 more seconds before you modify it. Let it exist in your mind, at full volume. Sometimes you'll deliver it, sometimes you won't. But training that awareness, the noticing, is how you begin to interrupt the selective muting strategy at the source, rather than downstream. Step 3. Stop treating every silence as a gap you need to fill. Silence in conversation is not dead space. It is a surface on which meaning accumulates. When you fill every pause out of discomfort, out of fear that the other person is forming a negative judgment, you dilute everything that came before it. You teach the people around you that your words are abundant, which means they become cheap. The calibration protocol is not about creating artificial mystery. It is about recognizing that communication has a supply and demand dynamic exactly like any other resource. What is scarce is valued. What is constant, reflexive, or anxious becomes background noise. Here's what happens next. You close this, and within 4 minutes you're somewhere else entirely. Notifications, a message, a video, a thought about something unrelated. And whatever felt true here will soften back into the general texture of things you know but don't apply. That's not a failure of will. It's just how cognitive salience works. It decays fast without reinforcement. But somewhere in the next conversation you have, particularly one where the stakes feel higher than they should, notice the moment you start pre-failing. Notice the sentence you know is true being quietly modified before it leaves your mouth. Notice the approval loop running. The real question isn't whether you're capable of communicating with more precision, more weight, more genuine authority. You already know you are. The real question is why, even now, knowing what you know, you are still so afraid of being fully understood.